celebrating our 20th season. From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now, here's your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Our topic today is the planet Earth dying, the vanishing species. We're very, very fortunate to have as our guest a gentleman today who is highly qualified to address this particular issue. We welcome to our program Dr. David Hicks, who is with the Whitworth College in Spokane, Washington. He serves in the Department of Biology, where he has served with distinction for 25 years. Our guest holds a bachelor's degree from Cascade College in Portland, Oregon. He also holds a master's and PhD from the University of Georgia. And while at that university, he had the pleasure of studying under Dr. Eugene Odum, who was the Nobel Prize winner in the field of ecology in 1989. Dr. Hicks, it's a pleasure to have you on our program to discuss this very important topic. And I'm very pleased to have two of my colleagues with me today to serve as the panel. First of all is Lloyd Marsh, who teaches in the field of physical sciences and is in our program from time to time as a panel member. We also are very pleased to welcome to our panel once again from our faculty Bob Mary, who serves as the chair of the Division of Natural Sciences and teaches in the field of botany. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
And at this time I would like to ask Lloyd Marsh to commence the questioning.
Dr. Hicks, maybe you could put this in perspective a little and give our audience a little background on how you got into and what your interest is in the particular area of the vanishing species.
I'm an ecologist by training, and I've done a lot of traveling. I taught for a year in Hong Kong, and I've spent about 3 years in Central America. And it's been obvious to me over the last 25 years that things are changing, that biological diversity is decreasing, that human activities are taking a great toll on many kinds of species. I'm particularly interested in migratory birds. And in that case, I think every single species that has been monitored by the Audubon Crispus count has shown declining populations in the last decade or two.
Bob Mary.
You talked about the decrease in biological diversity. I find that my classes have a hard time comprehending the importance of that. Would you care to elaborate on why it's important to have this diversity?
I have a saying that I repeat so often that someone made me a little banner for my office, and that is that diversity produces stability. Nature seems to want to, if I can use that anthropogenic or anthropomorphic term, seems to want to stock every habitat with the maximum number of kinds of things. And it seems to be a good insurance policy. No matter how the environment changes, some of those species will benefit from that change. So if you have to go into an unknown future and you want to survive, then if you have as many components to the system as possible, then you increase the chances of surviving. And that sort of goes against our cultural view that the way to survive is to be lean and efficient and conform to a very rigid standard. But nature is profligate, if I could use that word, and I like that.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Hicks, in a presentation you gave recently at a symposium, you were very detailed and very informative about what is happening, and I introduced this program as the vanishing species. Would you identify for our TV audience what you mean by vanishing species, identify those different types and where they are in the world, and the seriousness of this particular issue?
Right. Yes, I have a little chart here from a book, State of the World, 1992, which is the most widely read environmental book. Now, it's given to every member of Congress and all foreign heads of state. It's produced by Lester Brown of the World Watch Institute. And he says that worldwide amphibians are especially in decline, perhaps because they have a wet skin, and so they're subject to all sorts of air pollution and acid rain and anything that's in the water. And it's been noted that, for instance, in the southeastern United States, which has a particularly diverse amphibian biota, that there's a tremendous decline in both numbers and species. Among birds, 3/4 of all the world's bird species are declining in population or are threatened with extinction. Among fish, 1/3 of North America's freshwater fish stocks are rare, threatened, or endangered. And among invertebrates, about 100 species of these tiny things, mostly insects, are lost every day due to deforestation. Western Germany, for instance, reports 1/4 of all its invertebrates endangered. And half of the freshwater snails of the southeastern United States are extinct or nearly so. Among mammals, half of Australia's mammals are on the endangered species list. Among carnivores, all kinds of wild cats and bears are especially threatened with extinction. Among primates, to which group we belong, 1/3 of the world's 150 species are now threatened with extinction. And among reptiles, about 40% of all the world's turtles are known to be threatened with extinction. So this is a major crisis biologically, and it's global.
Along with that, we hear a lot about, particularly in South America, where tremendous acreage is being destroyed, the natural forest, and what's happened to wetlands and so forth. As someone who's very informed and is well trained in the field of ecological issues, what is that doing to the planet, not only to the species that you're identifying, but to the ozone layer and all these things? What level of seriousness are we talking about?
The amount of deforestation is just amazing. I have a little quote that says the area deforested is equal to half the size of Finland, but that doesn't mean much to us. So I looked at a United States map, and basically everything in the Northwest, everything west of Boise and north of Boise, that is parts of Idaho, half of Washington, and the entire state of Washington, that's the area of tropical forest that we lose every year. It's enormous. And primarily we're losing species there by the thousands that have not even been identified. There's some interesting experiments done in which they fog the forest canopy. And they just put big sheets down and collect all these insects primarily that fall down. And in many samples, 70% are totally unknown, never been seen before. So we're destroying a resource that we have not yet inventoried. And the forests are the lungs of the planet, so to speak. They absorb carbon dioxide, and by cutting down the forest, you do two things. When you cut down the forest, you increase the environmental carbon dioxide, because typically they burn a lot of this. And then that forest is not there to absorb it, so we get a double whammy by destroying tropical forests, and it's very serious. But there's enormous economic pressure on the third world to repay their debts. And the way they repay their debt is to harvest natural resources to sell to us. So the third world debt is intimately connected with the environmental destruction of tropical habitats.
Lloyd Marsh.
Yes, and just following up on that question, in order to preserve the species, what do we have to do? I mean, do we have to change our way of life? Do we have to address these economic pressures? Can man live in harmony with nature in the style that we've become accustomed to?
That's a good question. I think, first of all, we have to understand the other species on the planet. We have to know what their life requirements are. And then we have to give them space enough to do that. So we probably can't save many species with national parks that are only 10 or 20 square miles. We have to have fairly extensive areas which allow the entire life cycle of that species to occur. In the case of some large animals such as caribou that migrate across vast distances, we need to preserve that habitat if we're going to preserve that species. And then what we can do with our own lifestyle. I read once that this planet can support 1 billion people in our lifestyle, at our level. There are already more than 5 billion here. So it's obvious that we need to decrease our consumption. Consumption has become a good, and I think we need to define happiness and contentment and security in terms other than amassing enormous amounts of material things.
Bob Mary.
As you said, I guess our society seems to be dollar-driven. how do we convince someone that there is value in preserving these species that we don't even know about? If you can't eat it, if you can't wear it, if you can't play with it, what good is it? A lot of people are going to say, it costs me my job if we're going to preserve these things. What would be some value in saving these species besides environmental stability? That's hard to sell.
What's the value of the black-footed ferret or the spotted owl, or on and on? I think that we have a major hurdle to overcome in the fact that most of the people who create the most pressure on the environment are affluent and urban. And urban people simply are not connected with nature. They simply don't understand how nature works. They assume that the most important things in life are the gross national product, the Dow Jones Index, and the health of the Republican or Democratic Party. And I would submit that all civilizations, all cultures, will prosper only as their underlying life support system is preserved. So that's the big picture. That is, we have to preserve the earth if we want to continue to live here. Secondly, we need to be more efficient about how we live. I just heard on the way over here that by the year 2006, they say that the average fleet mileage for American cars could be 37 miles per gallon. Well, why do we need to wait to 2006? Why can't we do that more quickly? The Montreal Accords about ozone-depleting chemicals has a rather leisurely schedule for replacing CFCs. Why can't we speed that up? I think we need to educate ourselves to live more frugally. And that's not a very popular word now. We're more impressed with amassing and acquiring than we are with being frugal. But they say that, for instance, this generation that's coming through college now probably will not live at the same level of affluence as their parents. So there are economic pressures, real things out there that are causing us to reconsider our lifestyle. And I think those kinds of things are important. They come from everywhere. I think history could tell us that. Religion should be telling us that. And I think that ecology has some lessons that should have ready cultural applications. And I consider that as one of my tasks to try to get that vision out to students.
Dr. Hicks, in a previous conversation I had with you, you indicated that there was, from what I believe you were saying, some misconceptions that when we were in the heavy industry period of our economy, we identified a lot of the pollutants and so forth. But now that we've moved more to what we call a service industry or information industry, that lightens up the effects on the ecological balance. And you take a different position than that, do you not?
Well, there are some terms you hear which would indicate that we are no longer raping the environment. Things like the post-industrial age, or the service-oriented economy, or the information-based society. And this sounds like we quit mining things, that now we're just talking to each other and it's all electronic. But if you actually look at the consumption per person, it's up and it's growing. So it's true that most people now work in service jobs, but what that means environmentally is that our extractive industries have simply been mechanized. And we have coal mining machines which will mine more than 1,000 people could. And we have all sorts of technology which makes our process of resource extraction very efficient. We're still doing this. And so I think we have the wrong sort of impression from these words which sound like we passed through this heavy-duty coal mining stage. Now we haven't. And we're still using resources at an increasing rate. And for instance, West Germany is a culture that's equally affluent to ours, but their energy consumption is about 50% of ours. And we need to do things to increase our efficiency quickly.
Lloyd Marsh.
Can we sort of shift the emphasis here? And since your expertise is in the area of migratory birds, there's been a lot of news and coverage lately about the wetlands, preservation of the wetlands. And what are we in this country, the United States, doing about the wetlands?
Migratory birds are declining primarily because of habitat destruction. That is, very few species of migratory birds are useful products in themselves. And they're declining because we keep taking away especially their nesting areas, but occasionally their wintering areas. Would you repeat the question?
Yeah, we want to know what proactive efforts we're making in this country to preserve that habitat, the wetlands. Is there an action afoot that can do this for us?
Well, I think, first of all, we now have objective data about what the planet consists of. We have satellite photographs, which are wonderful. And you can find all the wetlands or all the deserts or all of any kind of habitat you like just by asking the computer the right questions. So we know where these things are. The next stage is to have some laws which preserve those. And the laws need to allow economic activity, but also ecological preservation. And I think we're in that stage now, and there are many, many lively debates, including the spotted owl debate, which indicate that ecology and economy are contesting in our culture for our attention and for our loyalty. And eventually we have to serve both masters. We have to preserve the environment because that's where our wealth comes from eventually. And obviously we're not going to change our economy drastically, although we need to pick a direction. We need to pick more sustainable goals for our economy. So I think that when that happens, when we can begin to refocus what we take and why, then we can have more left over for other species.
All right. And just on a follow-up question, I understand that later this year or next year they're going to have there's a worldwide conference. Is it in Rio? Called the Earth Conference. Is that going to address these kind of issues, habitat preservation?
That's a wonderful conference. It's called the UN Conference on Environment and Development. And the first world countries are coming to talk about the environment, and the third world countries are coming to talk about development. So we have this global forum now in which we're going to talk about development and environment, which seem to be contradictory kinds of motivations. The third world is going to say lots of interesting things to us, among which are the first world has caused most environmental destruction, beginning with the colonial period, but certainly now with the high tech and high population pressures. And so the third world is going to say, you created the problems and you should pay to clean them up everywhere, even in our country. They probably will also say, one of the things that increases our pressure on the environment is trying to pay back our debts. So we want to just renunciate those debts. We just want to do nothing about it. Besides, we've already given you enormous wealth during the colonial period. You hauled it home in galleons of gold, and so let's just call it even. That will take enormous pressure off the environment. I think this is going to be a soul-searching episode, these 12 days in Rio, the first part of June. And I hope we can respond without being defensive and without being nationalistic. This is not the time to defend the rights of the United States or Japan or Ghana. This is the time to act as a citizen of the world and to take a more global and a much longer-term perspective.
Bob Murray.
We sort of cut our teeth on ecology in the 60s, probably for the four of us was the first time we encountered it. And then it died out, and now it's coming back again, and more in terms of rainforest than anywhere else. We all talk about we ought to save the rainforest. We hear some about the wetlands, but how about right here, let's say in the Inland Empire? Is there something we should be doing for declining species in this area? I haven't heard anything, that is on the way out. We have some endangered species list. I couldn't name any of the specimens on that list, and I don't know if anyone else could. Are there any hot spots in this area that we should be looking at?
Well, it's easy to get excited about the panda bear. They're big and cuddly. And you're right. We should focus people's efforts here. Most people are not going to go to Africa and save the rainforest or South America. And we should be working here. We have problems with Lake Coeur d'Alene with heavy metal depositions there. We need to know more about that. I mean, this college and my college ought to be having students out there taking water samples and really outlining that problem. We have air pollution problems in Spokane. We have inversions. We ought to see what we can do in the way of industrial controls. We ought to see what could be done in terms of economic incentives to reduce that. We have problems with logging and clear cutting and erosion and silting up of spawning beds of salmon and trout. There are lots of local kinds of things. We have overwintering eagles on Lake Coeur d'Alene that should be preserved. This is a very, very important part of their life cycle, and it's a wonderful thing to go out and watch them, but does anybody know whether the habitat is changing so that it's less hospitable for those big birds of prey? So I think if you look, you could find this. I know my wife's an elementary teacher, and they talk a lot about these things, and there are some interesting educational programs in which students look at a local pond or a local flora and fauna. But I agree with you that saving the world begins right outside this building.
You mentioned your wife teaches in elementary school. Mine teaches life science in middle school, and her students are very interested in this. When do students lose this interest and are willing to kill and cut down?
I think the economic realities of growing up now in hard times, relatively speaking, cause people to revert to the bottom line mentality. We've been taught that that the economic analysis is the final criteria of value, and I think we need to teach people that aesthetics and species diversity and these things have great value. That is, we need to have two models in people's minds. We need to have the economic and the ecological values so that people can make rational decisions. If people are largely ignorant of ecology, which they are, and relatively conversant with economic principles, then it's no wonder that we keep making decisions that way. And I think when people grow up and have to get a job and survive, then they start to say, well, yes, a job in the woods is better than an owl in the woods, even though that's not really the problem. Jobs in forests are declining because of mechanization, because we're exporting raw logs, because there are actually fewer forests to cut, and all sorts of reasons. And the spotted owl is the symbol of that. And another thing that we need to do, I think, is to get people to be more rational and more complex. We can't decide environmental issues or preservation of species on bumper stickers. And we need to pay attention to it and really understand it. And that's what this program's doing.
Professor, if we were to continue the rate we have of consumption in the Western world, and then the Third World was to start doing that also, under a timetable that one could look at, how long would it be till there would be a real crisis? I know it's that what you're discussing is crisis oriented now, but what would happen to this planet, and how quickly would that take place?
Well, I think we could begin with our energy supplies. Probably within the lifetime of many people watching the program, we will not be getting most of our energy for the economy from fossil fuels. That's going to be an enormous change. So that's in a fairly short lifespan, 3 or 4 decades. At the rate of species extinction, which is about 100 times greater now than any other previous extinction for which we have fossil records. So we could lose 20 or 30% of the entire flora and fauna of the planet within the next couple of decades. That's very serious. Global warming, which appears to be a fact, and I believe 7 of the hottest years in the last century occurred in the last decade. Ozone depletion, which is much worse than we had anticipated, and the hole each year is getting bigger faster than we thought it would. I think that the next 20 or 30 years are really critical, and I think that the 90s, the rest of this century, we have a magnificent opportunity to analyze and understand the problems and begin to turn some things around.
If we do not do that, is there a point at which it'll be irreversible and it will be too late to do anything about it?
I think, yes, we can diminish the planet, the richness of the planet as far as species. We can destroy things out there and not have products that we desperately need. We'll not have new foods and new medicines and new fibers. So we're actually putting a cap on human progress as it depends upon the material world. And I think that that should shock us. And I'm waiting to see some of the more traditional disciplines become shocked. You know, I'm waiting for philosophy and religion and the humanities to show some more excitement and concern and commitment to these kinds of things.
I think I hear you saying then that if we don't engage in certain kinds of conservation methods and preservation methods, that even though that appears by not doing that, that you might be helping the economy, that you're really going to destroy the economic lifestyle we have.
Right. And I think that we simply don't have the idea yet that our happiness and our contentment are based upon preserving our life support system. I think it's interesting to compare some human views. I don't know which Roman general it was who came and said, I came, I saw, I conquered. That's an incredibly arrogant approach to reality, even though it might have been true in that local situation. I like much more the first astronaut who looked out the cabin window and looked back at this planet, and he said, this is a tiny, fragile blue ball floating in space, and we should love it and nurture it and care for it. I mean, that's the attitude that we need to have. And
Lloyd Marsh.
And that's one of the questions that I would be prompted to ask. How can we be more proactive? You alluded to the education process. We start off in the grade schools with people like your children, your wife is teaching. And then we go on to educating, but what do we have to do? Do we have to bring pressure on our politicians that make the laws, that establish these regulations? What can we
I think
do?
there's a fundamental problem with politics and politicians in that they're a short-term sort of thing. A politician has to perform to some 2-year or 4-year or 6-year limit, and ecological problems need a long-term concern. That is, we have to ensure somehow politically that we identify the problem and pay attention to it until it's solved. That is, we had a gas crisis, and so we started building smaller cars. Then the price of gas went down, and so we started building bigger cars. This is nonsense. This is economic fiddling, and we need to take a long-term view. We need to pick a goal out there that's attainable, and then move toward it without deviation, and that's a hard thing.
Dr. Hicks, on that note, we have to bring our permanent conclusion. On behalf of our panel and our staff, thank you for taking time out today and being with us. It's been a most informative program.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Dr. David Hicks from the Department of Biology at Whitworth College in Spokane, Washington. I know that you have found this most informative, and I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time when we shall discuss an important issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.
I mean, I think as the pressure increases, we'll become